Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for joining my Zoom room. There was a little snafu where the school Zoom wasn't letting me in. I don't know why, but we are here now. Can everyone hear me? Just go ahead and throw in a chat. Yes, keep going. If you can't hear me, let me know. But big picture, we're here for one reason tonight. The goal will be for each of you to walk away having a better understanding of what the current trends are in admissions. Oh, need some folks, hold on. Hey, folks, as you're joining, can you please make sure to mute yourselves? Hey. So, as we get going, my goal will be to make sure that everyone tonight has a better understanding of the current trends in admissions. What's going on? What are the realities? How are these trends going to impact you as we go down the pipeline? We're going to cover a number of different topics, and my goal, as I mentioned before, will be to make sure that you have an opportunity to ask any questions in the middle, during, before, after.
I'm in, guys.
So please don't hesitate to use the chat if you have questions, or when we pause, come off mute. To that point, my name is Jordan Kanarek. I'm the founder of Kanrek Consulting. I'm a partner at Collegewise, and I am an admissions nerd. So yes, I do spend a lot of time reading different articles, taking on new journeys to learn more about trends in admissions. I'm doing a fun webinar for me called Common Data Set for BCC down the line. We're going to dig into some very specific data. My point is, I promise you that the information that I have to offer today doesn't only come from my nerding out on this, but also from Collegewise, largest national group of college counselors in the nation. We've spent over 2 decades curating different aspects of the application process to make sure that our students on webinars or who we work with one-on-one have access to all the tools they need to be successful in this process. So, to that point, you're not here to learn about me today. You're here to learn about a number of topics in the admissions realm. By the end of this, you should have a much greater familiarity with the different topics on the page in front of you. Sorry, folks, I need to people it seems. One moment. End of the day, admissions has changed dramatically since COVID hit, which is crazy to say because it's only been a couple years and a lot has happened in these couple of years. But to that point, admissions numbers have gone up, admit rates have gone down, students are applying to more schools than ever before. So this evening, I'm hoping that you will come away understanding more about what is required of you to make sure that you have options in this process, to make sure that you have the opportunity to pursue the colleges of interest to you. And if for some reason those are not the right schools for you, we'll discuss what it is that you need to do to identify those right fit institutions. That in mind, let's start with some knowledge that you may or may not already have. For many people, there's this assumption that I'm going to shoot for the Yales, the Stanfords, the Harvards. And you know what? If I have to use a Boston University as a backup, pardon me, folks, a Boston University as a backup, or Duke, or whatever it may be, that's fine. Well, I hope those of you on this call know that Duke is no longer anyone's backup. In fact, Duke is one of the most selective universities in the nation now, given that they have a 4.1% admit rate in regular decision. But the numbers here show you that right now, the way that admissions are going, schools like Boston University, which is a very good institution, but Boston University has a lower admit rate now than Harvard did just 20 years ago. Why do I share news like this with you? It is not to scare you or worry you or make you think that you are not capable of getting in. It is to make sure you have an understanding of what it's like in the admissions realm right now, what it is you will need to do in order to potentially make a viable and strong list. End of the day, no one can tell you where you can or cannot apply. But what I can tell you today is that there are more selective institutions in the nation now than there were before COVID. There are reasons why. We're going to dig into those shortly, but I want to make sure you understand the shifting that we are dealing with right now. So to that point, just to give you some more data points here. On the left-hand side, you will see schools that you've probably heard of in the past. You will also see their admit rates in the early to mid 90s and their admit rates now. At the very top is one of my favorite data points. The University of Southern California, which back when I was your age was known as the University of Spoiled Children, now has a 10% admit rate. Only a few years back, really 30-ish years back, they had a 70% admit rate. And if you came from the East Coast, it was almost higher because they were doing everything they could to improve their geographic diversity. So what does that mean? It means that schools that when your parents were applying to college may have been less selective or easier to get into, no longer sit in that category. In fact, many of them are nearly impossible to get into now. And they'll only take a couple kids from any given school, any given year. I don't tell you this in the hopes that I crush any dreams about Columbia or Harvard or Berkeley or whatever it may be. I tell you this because it's important that as you build a college list, you understand that just because a parent went there in 1984 or because grandpa is an alumni there, doesn't mean that your chances of getting in are much stronger than they used to be. In fact, many schools, and this is one of the trends we're seeing, are starting to move away from the legacy decisions. Why? Great question. Because they're recognizing that legacy decisions do not offer you the same chance to get to know your student body or to bring in the diverse student body you want. In fact, it's only perpetuating the issue that they see in admissions right now of people with money or from certain areas getting in, people from elsewhere not. In fact, it's one of the big trends that we're seeing, which is a focus on institutional priorities. I can't see anyone right now because we all have our cameras off. We're doing a webinar, not a seminar, but raise your hand if you know somebody who did not get into University of Maryland this last round, who you were surprised didn't get into University of Maryland. And you can use the chat here as well. The numbers were astounding. Many people did not get in this last cycle because, and their thought is, it's, well, because I wasn't good enough this year. Oh my gosh, Maryland became one of the most selective institutions. I'm sure they had a big increase in applications, no doubt about it. Many schools did. But the main reason is because of something that you have no control over. Institutional priorities. And no, they're not going to tell you what those institutional priorities are any given year. One year, it might be that they want more students from the Midwest who are pursuing STEM. It could be that this year we're actually going to take more in-state students from X county because we had a lack of them last cycle. Or in the case of Maryland, it's because for many years now, students in the Montgomery County area have snubbed the University of Maryland. They've looked at it as a perfectly viable backup option if I need it, but this isn't where I want to go. Folks, please make sure that you're muting yourselves as you're coming. Thank you very much. They want to make sure that end of the day, they get the class they want and that it doesn't take them 30,000 admits to get there. Why? Because of yield. Yield is the percentage of accepted students who end up attending my institution each year. So let's use Maryland as an example, and I'm going to make up an arbitrary fake number here for ease. Let's say that this year Maryland wants 500 new students. So to get those 500 new students, if they only took 500, they likely wouldn't get the other. So you take 500, are you going to get all 100%? Probably not. Let's say you get 50%. Well, that's only 250 and I wanted 500. So they need to accept a certain number in order to make sure they hit that 500. The Ivies, for example, theirs are anywhere between 60 to 75% usually, sometimes a little bit lower. So a school like Maryland needs to accept very big numbers in order to get their yield. So when students from the MoCo area are always applying and very rarely attending unless they have a field they want to, Maryland takes that as a snub. And so they look at the statistics, they look at the data, and they say, you know what? If I am not going to attract all these students, I'm going to take fewer. I'm going to accept students from Anne Arundel County, from PG County. I'm going to take kids from Baltimore County, kids who are going to take advantage of this in-state pricing and who I know are more likely to come than MoCo students who do not. And they use statistics and data they've collected over the last few years to make that decision. Now, the number of students who I've heard say, yeah, but I would have gone there if they accepted me. I get it. It's frustrating because it's not a perfect system, but it is how they go about this to ensure, in their eyes, they're getting the most diverse class possible by accepting the fewest number of students possible. And to give you an example here, between 2021 and 2023, between these 2 years, the admit rates at each of these schools dropped because through data and data science and data mining, they figured out how many kids they needed to accept to get their ideal yield. So you look at one like the University of Chicago, who in 2021 accepted 2,460 students. 2 years later, they accepted nearly 500 students fewer, 600 students, pardon me, and still had the same result. So it's no wonder that when admit rates are going down and student application numbers are going up, that now it's even more difficult than ever before because they need to take fewer students, even though they have more applications coming in. Because the average student is applying to 15, 16, 17 schools right now, thinking if I throw out this many, one of these reaches has to hit. But given the trends that we're seeing, that's no longer the case. There are plenty of strong applicants who many of you may or may not know who are not getting into 10, 12 schools that they're applying to. Whereas 5 to 10 years ago, that strong applicant, if they applied to that same number, just based on the roll of the die, should have gotten 1 or 2. I'm going to pause here because first off, numbers are scary. And secondly, I want to make sure that any questions on your minds around things like admissions, trends on the anything of that nature can be addressed. So let me pause. Go ahead and take to the chat. I'm going to wait a minute to see if there are any questions. You're welcome to come off mute if you'd like to ask that way instead. Yes, yield is, well, the way yield is calculated is the percentage of admitted students who end up attending. So if I want 1,000 students, I may need to accept 3,000 to make sure I get that 1,000. If I don't take enough, I'm under enrolled. And if I'm under enrolled, I don't bring in the money that I need to this cycle. If I over enroll, I can't say all of a sudden, oh, you 3 can't come anymore. It actually means that the next class is negatively impacted because I over enrolled by 50 students this cycle. That means next cycle, I have to accept 50 fewer students to make sure that I have space. I see a couple people came off mute. Please go ahead. Okay. To the chat, there's somebody asked about SAT. I'm going to be covering SAT, so I'm going to skip that question for now. Do you see the focus on propensity to enroll being something permanent or prioritized going forward? That's a good question. I do believe that it will be prioritized going forward. Before, many of these schools knew they were going to get their numbers. Now they're not as sure because with students applying to 16, 17, 18 schools, right? Well, if I take that student and they get into 12 other schools, when they used to get into 7 other, my chances of being the school they choose just went down. So this is going to be a bigger focus. In fact, it's probably going to bring more schools to look at demonstrated interest, a topic we'll talk about shortly. It may also push more students towards the early decision route, another topic we'll discuss. What are the sources for your numbers? These numbers are pulled from the common data set, which tends to be 2 years old. We should have the 2024 data in about 16 months. How does yield change at private, public, and in-state and out-of-state, or at the specific college school level versus university? Yield changes dramatically any given year. Like, for example, Rutgers this past cycle had a 60% increase in applications. That's going to have a huge impact on their yield because they don't know how many students they're going to be able to attract who've actually applied. So, end of the day, yield gets hugely impacted by huge increases in applications. But the answer to your question is it fluctuates any given year. Like look at Northeastern. The difference is nearly halved in 2 years here. How does one trust the match, reach, and safety schools that College Board spits out? It's very difficult to do that with a mixture of institutional priorities as well as the change in these trends. So I know some people who've built lists off Chat GPT, for example, and it's thrown together some fine lists, but they tend to be very reach heavy because you tend to focus on the strength of major or the proximity to home. And when those two things come together, you find that many other students from your area are applying. Your example of Montgomery County students snubbing the UMD, was it a figure of speech or do you have data behind it? It's both. I don't have this year's data. UMD has not released what their specific institutional priorities are, nor will they ever. They have no reason to tell you what their institutional priorities are. But when you look at the data of the admitted students that was shared out with many counselors in the Maryland area, it's very clear that they're going to take the highest level students at these schools in hopes that those MoCo kids would raise the bar, and then they were going to accept a great number of students outside of that in order to fill the rest of the class for their in-state population. So a lot of it is me deducing from what I have. I won't have all the data yet, but because it takes about a year to 2 to release it, but that's what we're seeing. Is yield only calculated at university level or at any subset of data within the applicant pool? It's both, because they want their students from all over the world. They'll go to a wait list to get a kid from Montana to make sure they have that 50th state before they take another strong student from Virginia, because they already have tons of them. So it's both. All right, I'm going to keep us moving forward here, and I promise I will continue to come to the chat, but we have a lot to cover here. Part of this we've already talked about with the questions being asked, but the big why here. Oh, let me go ahead and mute some folks. The big why here is because a number of reasons. One, and the biggest one from my experience, is the mission of public universities is changing and evolving. It used to be that your in-state institution was available to you if you had a decent GPA to a great GPA. But now these public institutions, from Maryland to the UCs, have basically stated they're going to exist to bring up the middle and lower classes. Their goal is to create opportunities for students whose applications may not be able to be as far-reaching as other students. Now, there's an argument to be made, well, that's not fair. My student wants to go there. Why should I be punished because of where I live or because of where my student goes? I'm in full agreement with that belief. But for right now, until colleges figure out how to deal with the yield issues they're dealing with and students snubbing them or the expectation set by the state for them to get state money, they're going to play the numbers game and take students who they know they're going to get. We're also seeing a huge increase in students trying to transfer or dropping out of college. You had Dartmouth, who recently published a 20-page paper stating that the reason they're bringing test scores back is they need it to get a sense of who's actually going to be able to handle it. The University of Southern California has had more students drop out in the past year or two than they have in years prior. And they're saying that it might be because without test scores, we don't actually know if students can hang, if they can handle this. Truth be told, these are the two institutions who just 5 to 7 years ago said, these scores mean nothing. We don't need them. So why have they switched back? We're going to cover that more shortly, but really it's probably because they need to cull the number of applications they're getting. The other thing is college is getting more and more expensive. So people are turning more and more to their in-state institution or to schools that can offer them that money. So a school like UMD, who in years past may not have gotten as many applicants from MoCo because they're just like, we're going to go elsewhere. Well, now that college like a GW costs $80,000 to $85,000 all in, man, no, I'm going to consider UMD or UMBC or Towson, which is $25,000, rightfully so. These are all reasons as to why we are seeing institutional priorities shift and why we are seeing more applications go out. And it all comes from the pandemic. There are many things that we can blame the pandemic for, but from a college culture perspective, one of the biggest is this change in the SAT and ACT usage. There was a year where, other than the state schools in Florida and Georgia, because they didn't believe that COVID actually was an issue, every other state said, we're going to forego it. We don't need these scores. You can apply without them. So what happened? The consumer changed their mind on how they will approach this system. In fact, I call it bad consumer behavior. all of a sudden you have students who may or may not have had any business applying to a school like a Harvard, a Yale, or even a UVA or so on, saying, well, since they don't need that test score, I might as well take my shot, right? That student may have had a 3.5, 3.6 GPA, A's with some B's, right? And even if they had test scores required, their 1320 wouldn't cut it. But now that I don't need that 1320, they're not going to look at that. Why don't I give it a shot? Do I blame anyone for taking a shot? Absolutely not. That's your prerogative. But it's be a bit of an issue in creating more applications. And when you create more applications of that nature, you find yourself in a position where even if they're not more qualified, admissions offices have to shift the way they approach things. So outside that, there's also been a huge flight to quality. I mentioned college and majors here, but the major piece is a much bigger one. You're finding a lot more students pursuing majors like computer science, engineering, information science, business, biology, because that's how they think they need to pursue pre-med. There's a lot of misinformation as far as what you need to do to go to law school or grad school or any of these. So my point is, when everyone starts applying to the same schools in the South because of their big sports culture, and thinks they have to be a business major, a bio major, a comp sci major, an engineering major, and they're all coming from the same area, that's going to have a bit of an impact. Clemson's a perfect example. You take a few different things and put them together. National championship with Trevor Lawrence kind of coming in, throwing the ball, winning big games. A beautiful location, strong emphasis on their business to their comp sci majors and money coming in. Oh, and now we're test optional. Well, a lot of students from MoCo started applying to Clemson. So I'm sure many of you know a friend or somebody in the last year or two with a 1400 SAT, a 3.9 GPA, who was deferred from early action and then waitlisted at a Clemson. Why? Because they have so many applicants coming from the same place applying for the same thing. They're going to take a few, but they don't need all of them. So it's just making it much more competitive than even before for an area, Montgomery County, that's already hyper competitive. So the consequences? In-state schools are no longer a sure thing, unfortunately, at least not the flagship ones. Other state schools are using this as an opportunity to try and convince you to come. Not Virginia Tech, UVA, UNC. I'm talking more along the lines of states that are a bit further away or state schools that are slightly less selective. What does this mean? Students need to expand their reach. I'm not telling you have to go to Kentucky now, although great business program and a really strong comp sci program, just saying. But what I am saying is if you're looking to pay less for college or you're looking for options that aren't as selective, you're going to have to look a bit further or in areas that may not be as interesting at the get-go or at schools where not everyone else from your institution or the schools around you like WJRM and so on are applying. And the other thing, and we're going to cover this shortly, early applications. That early decision we're seeing is a big factor to consider at this time. So going back to a question somebody asked not too long ago in the chat, and I'm going to go to the chat now. So if anyone wants to throw more questions in, you can absolutely use free tools like bigfuture.com, which is the College Board site, or ChatGPT to build a list. But what you need to avoid is building a list based solely on things along the lines of strength of major or proximity to home. Oh, I don't know what just happened. One moment. There we go. We're seeing more and more students who think that they want to go to these schools, and that may be true. But one of the biggest things that I can tell you unequivocally is that great things happen at institutions across the nation. And if you don't want to believe me, I strongly encourage you to watch Malcolm Gladwell's Zeitgeist. It's on YouTube. It's 45 minutes of him using data to prove why you could go to a Western Kentucky, a Northern Oklahoma, and be more successful than if you went to even a Harvard. You may be laughing at that notion, but if you are, I strongly encourage you to watch that video. That in mind, before we keep going, any questions that I can address, feel free to come off mute. Feel free to type in the chat. We're going to cover some of the themes that we're seeing in a moment, but I want to kind of cover the yield piece into sort of the consequence of pandemic, so on. Anything on your mind?
I have a question.
Yeah.
For certain schools, how, like, if they are test optional, how bad is it to go to actually go test optional, if you don't think you have the score to get in, but like you have the GPA, you just don't have the score, how bad is it to go test optional?
So it's a very good question. I'm actually going to cover that in 2 slides. So I promise you we're going to get back to that, but it is a very good question. And the short answer of it is, because of where you're applying from, the preference will be that you are not test optional, but that doesn't mean you can't do it. I will come back to that in a greater sense, I promise. Any other questions? And for those of you asking in the chat, the video was called Malcolm Gladwell's Zeitgeist. I might be misspelling it. My German is not strong. Spanish is just a little bit better. But if you type in Malcolm Gladwell, ZEI, the YouTube algorithm should pick up the rest. Okay. Part of the issue here is that we are seeing more students with an A average coming out of high school than ever before. And these are not weighted A's. This is more and more students than there were in like 2010 by nearly 12 to 15% graduating high school with an A average. So when you have that many strong applicants applying in a given year, one of the things that they used to use to really understand whether or not you were someone they would want or whether or not you're going to stand out in their class, unfortunately, was the test score. And for that reason, schools are starting to bring it back. You probably heard, and if not, Dartmouth, University of Texas at Austin, Brown, Yale, they're bringing test score requirements back. Harvard has said that by 2029, well, 2029 is the first year they're going to bring it back. And I would not be surprised if we start seeing more and more schools go this route. Part of that is for the same reason MIT did it the year after COVID. MIT had such a big uptick in applications that it basically broke the admissions office. They lost admissions officers who'd been there a decade because they couldn't handle it anymore. They found themselves in a position where they didn't get their decisions out for 2 or 3 weeks late. And quite frankly, they weren't as proud of that class as they had been with others, solely because they had so many more applicants. I, for one, am a huge proponent of test optional. But if we want to be test optional, we also have to work with the system. And when we break the system by applying to 18 to 20 schools that, quite frankly, many of which we probably shouldn't have, but did just because of a test score, well, at that point, they have to do something to make sure that they have the ability to create the ideal class for them without having too many applicants. I mean, Yale, for example, went up from 36,000 like 53,000 in 2 years. Absurd. Rutgers, 60% year over year. University of Tennessee, Knoxville, 43% year over year. Those are astounding numbers. And why did that happen? It's not that there are more people applying to college. It's that there are more people applying to more colleges. So, to answer the question from the young lady who came off mute, and it's a really good question, how test optional is test optional? My take is if you're coming from Montgomery County and you're applying to a highly selective institution, like an Ivy League or Ivy adjacent, like a Duke, your chances of getting in without a test score are unfortunately far lower than if you have a test score. And the reason is these admissions offices are not about to take a risk in their eyes if they have students who have the data point they like to see. So what does that mean? In essence, it means that if you have a test score, it's likely going to give you a slight leg up at the most selective universities because it's an extra piece of the pie that gives them a sense of where you stand. They're not going to say that out loud, but the numbers are showing that. And University of Michigan is a great example. Michigan stated that they are test optional through and through, baby, but their admits don't show that. Villanova has stated they're test optional. Their admits don't show that. Why? Because when you have enough students from one area, from 5 or 6 public schools that are really strong applying, and a good chunk of them have the test scores, I'm going to use that data point. I have a slide in another slideshow that I love to use. It's somebody who's skydiving, and then it says next to it, not an admissions officer. Why? Because admissions officers aren't risk takers at these schools. They might be risk takers at a less selective institution where they'll go below their average because they see something special in a student's application. But at these schools, Princeton, a couple of years ago, shared some really interesting data. Every year, they get roughly 2.5 classes worth of valedictorians. The number one individual in a class, they get 2.5 classes worth. So even if they wanted to take only valedictorians, which they don't, they've said they don't want all valedictorians, but even if they were going to just take valedictorians, they'd be denying a class and a half worth of valedictorians. And that doesn't even take into account the salutatorians who've also applied there, the students who have 4.0s and 12, 13 APs. There's a lot of very strong candidates applying. To answer your question, what about super score for SAT? They'll accept the super score, absolutely. If you got a 760 on math on this one and a 780 on reading this one, you'll send both scores, they'll super score it. They don't look at the other score, they're just going to use those 2 data points. And right there you have a, what is that math, Jordan? 1540, great score, well done. 1540, yeah, 1540. I swear I'm good at math. So my point is, super score or not, if your score is within their current 50th percentile or higher, you send it. If it's below, you probably don't. One caveat, and something you may already know, every school's score is currently artificially inflated because for the last 3 years, students have only submitted them if it's at the 50th percentile or higher. So if this year the 50th percentile is 1250 and people only submitted 1250 or higher.
Are you listening to a meeting?
I'm sorry?
No, me.
Okay. If your super score or score is at the 50th percentile, let's say that's a 1250, you submit it. But if everyone's submitting at 1250 or higher, the next year, of course, that numbers jump significantly. It's why Maryland had almost a 1370 average this last cycle, which is very high for them. It's not like it's that their score below was bad, but it's pretty high, right? I wouldn't be surprised if, as schools accept test scores back, they accept something that's a little bit lower than their current 50th percentile. So if you're within 20-ish points of that 50th percentile at some of these schools, I would still submit it. If you're well below it, I probably would not. If you're applying for a STEM major and do substantially better on a math section than a reading section, will they acknowledge that? They'll acknowledge it, but if you're still below the 50th percentile, I wouldn't submit it. So if your math is 750 and your reading's 500 and you're at a 1250 and the school's average is a 1320 or something like that, I'm still not submitting. They will want to see within at least close to that 50th percentile. Another trend, as I mentioned before, is the early decision. These data points here, by the way, these are not their admit rates in early decision. It's the percentage of the class they're filling with early decision. For Yale and Harvard, by the way, that's actually called restrictive early action. If you're not familiar with that term, what it means is that if you go REA or SCEA, single choice early action to Harvard or Yale, they will not allow you to go early decision to any school, and you cannot go early action to any other private school. You can go early action to a public school like a Maryland or a UNC or UVA or Virginia Tech, but you cannot go early action to any other private or early decision. Only a few schools do restrictive early action. Harvard, Yale, Georgetown removed it, so they're off that list. Notre Dame, Stanford, and Princeton. Those are the 5. What you'll see here, though, is schools like a Northwestern. By the time early decision ends, they've filled 50% of their class. Part of that is because they know that if they don't fill a good chunk here, they may not know what happens in regular decision. Sure, Northwestern's strong, but the student they're going to admit may be the same sort of student who gets admitted to a Brown or a Duke or a Yale. So by going big in early decision, they guarantee they fill a good chunk of their class. And then that means that they accept very few in regular decision. This past cycle, Northwestern had a 7% admit rate in regular decision. That was 7. Tulane has always, for the past 10 to 15 years, has filled a big chunk of their class in early decision, which means that in early action or regular decision, their admit rate is in the 11 to 13 to 14% admit rate, very low. Duke this year had a 12.2 or something percent admit rate in ED, 4.1% in regular decision, down into the Ivy-esque numbers like Columbia and Brown, who are in the high 3s. My point is this. Don't go ED to Duke because your chances are 3 times higher than in regular decision. Go ED to Duke because you're well within your right to do so as a strong applicant, and it's where you would go regardless of how much money you have to pay. Because the schools on this list minus Tulane and minus Boston University, the other 6, I wouldn't expect a dime in merit aid. Don't expect them to roll out any red carpet for you. If you can demonstrate through the FAFSA and the CSS profile, the financial aid forms you submit October of senior year, if you can prove to them that you are in need of financial aid, those schools will meet that financial aid. They'll give you what you need. But if you're in the position that many families in Montgomery County are, which is we won't meet that number, but we also don't want to pay $80,000 a year, be aware that Harvard, Yale, Columbia, Duke, Brown, Northwestern, a number of other schools may accept you an early decision, but you may be on the hook for $80,000, $90,000 nowadays. Tulane and BU are a bit better with financial aid or merit aid, pardon me, the money they'll give you to convince you to come there because they like you with no strings attached. But one note, regardless of your financial status, unless you are ready tomorrow to write an $80,000, $90,000 check and it doesn't hurt you, which by the way, congratulations. But if you aren't there, you should still apply with the FAFSA and CSS profile. Because a school like Boston University won't give you a dime unless they see that you're willing to give them the information they need. Tulane will do it, but if they have that information, it makes them easier to see that money might be an object for you, and that if they give you money, you may be willing to come. So my recommendation for every family I work with one-on-one and in these scenarios, fill out the FAFSA and CSS profile. Worst case scenario, you get nothing. Best case scenario, a school realizes this is a way to your heart and they offer you money. But my last piece of advice on the early decision front, don't waste it on the most selective school on your list just because you're like, oh, well, let me see what happens with it. Use it on a school that makes sense. You really like the idea of being within driving distance of home. Not too close, but you like it. You want a strong business program. You want to be close to a city, but not too close to a city. Or if you're in the middle of a city, that's okay, but you don't want to be like in the middle of nowhere, right? You want a decent student body size where at least one or two of the sports that are played there are good and you can go cheer them on. But outside that, realistically, you're kind of open. Maybe you're looking at UPenn because it's in Philadelphia, but they also have a very low admit rate. And you have a 3.8-ish GPA unweighted, 3.85, with 32 ACT. So we're below that UPenn number. To me, it probably doesn't make sense to go ED to UPenn. Where I might look at might be a Villanova. They meet all the requirements I just mentioned, from distance to a city, to home, to the sports, to the business program. And in early decision, they might be willing to take a student with a 3.85, whereas in regular decision from our area, most of the students getting in nowadays have a 4.0 out of Villanova. A school that 10 years ago, you needed a 3.6 or so. My point is, be smart in your approach with early decision. Obviously, it's your prerogative if you want to go for a UPenn or Northwestern, but consider the last couple of years and the students from your school who've been getting in. Take a look at your school's Naviance or score accounts and see from a scattergram how students are faring. If students who have higher GPAs than you and higher test scores and who you might have known they were the president of the Key Club are not getting in, ask yourself, am I open to get it? Before I keep going, are there any questions around early decision or test scores? Because I know those are two very hot topics. I'm going to wait a minute for people to be able to type, and then I will move on. EA versus ED. Early decision is a binding contract where if you get in, you must go. And in that case, you do improve your chances at almost every school that offers early decision. Early action is an opportunity for you to get your application out there earlier, but it doesn't have a huge difference. You might be able to hear back by mid-December that you got in, or that you didn't get in, or that you were deferred to regular decision. But early action doesn't make a huge difference. It just allows you to apply earlier. Now, that said, there is one school that you're all very familiar with, Maryland, who has stated they will take roughly 90% of their applicants in their priority deadline, which is their version of early action. So for Maryland specifically, you want to try and meet that early action deadline. The only reason not to go early action to a school, well, there's two. One, if you apply to Yale or Harvard and it's a private school, like I said, you can't go early action to the other private school because you went restrictive early action to Yale or Harvard. But the main reason not to go EA is because if you go EA, and your grades in junior year weren't great, they may just deny you. So if you struggle at the end of junior year, you might want to go regular decision and give them the chance to see you bounce back in senior year. Now, you got to keep in mind that you got to bounce back in senior year, otherwise you just hurt yourself. But it is worth considering that if junior year wasn't as great as it could have been, giving yourself that first semester of senior to bounce back and applying regular decision. A couple of questions coming in on those topics. The stats here that you're looking in front of you are for ED. More schools seem to do 2 ED phases. Is there a difference? Yes, there is a difference. In early decision 2, a college knows what happened. You went ED2 most often because you didn't get into your early decision school. You went ED to Northwestern. You didn't get in. So some schools like a Tulane, a Tufts, a Vanderbilt, Wake Forest, there's a number of others, offer early decision 2, meaning that you can bind yourself in a second round. Well, it does give you a better chance in ED2 than it does in regular decision, but depending on how strong that school's early decision round was, it may not give you much. If Tulane had a big ED round, they may just defer to regular decision, or waitlist most of their ED2 kids. There's also the chance that a number of kids from your school went ED, and if they went ED and got in, I don't need any more kids from your school in ED2. So you could potentially have that issue of like, oh, well, I shoot for the really high reach of Columbia in ED and then fall back to Tulane in ED2. Well, a lot of people do that. And that means that you're competing with another hyper-competitive group of students who were just not good enough maybe for their ED of Columbia, but who are just as good as you are, or as strong as you are for Tulane or for Vandy. So there is a difference, but not much. How does FinAid plan to ED if students get in but not enough aid? What's flexibility? So here's the rule of thumb. If you get in early decision, you're supposed to go. You're binding yourself. Theoretically, you can pull out, but if you do, you've essentially blackballed your high school for the next couple of years. Even if it's about financial reasons, you need to understand what you're saying in ED. If you are not in the expectations of getting financial aid, expect to pay full price. They might offer you loans, but loans are loans, right? Sometimes subsidized, unsubsidized, that's money you're paying back. So if you're going to go ED to an institution and you don't think you're going to meet the necessary mark off for financial aid, consider the fact that if you get in, you're going. If you don't, you back out, you're kind of putting yourself in a position where you got to go jump through a whole lot of rings in spring, and your school will be the ones who bear the brunt of it. A side note on this, if you're not sure whether or not you can expect money, go to college's NPCs, net price calculators. Type into Google, Northwestern net price calculator, Duke net price calculator, my alma mater, Gettysburg net price calculator. Every college has one, and you can enter in a few data points, and it'll spit out for you a rough estimate of your student's expected family contribution versus what a college might meet. Keep in mind, it's just a ballpark. Sometimes it's true, sometimes it ends up being a little less or a little more. But if you do that for 4 or 5 schools and all of them tell you that the school should cover 50,000 and you're going to cover 20, it's a pretty good chance that when you fill out the FAFSA and CSS profile, that will be the case. But how does FinAid plan to ED? They don't really focus too much on an ED. The one who is really bad about it is Duke. Duke, for some reason, just money begets money there, I guess. But like a Columbia, a Northwestern, a Brown, if they want you, they're going to take you an ED and give you the money you need. But need, not want. That in mind, there's a couple of do-nots here, folks. First off, like I said before, do not do this based solely off of major. If you type into Google right now, best schools for biology, you're going to get some great schools on that. You're going to get some great schools on that list, like Johns Hopkins, like Harvard, like Stanford. But if you do it based on that, you're not building a balanced college list. You're building a list based solely on highly selective colleges because they're ranked in this way. And all of a sudden, you just found yourself in a position where you may not get into any of your colleges because you base it solely off of the strongest institutions in the nation. Base it off of location, off of where you fall within their sort of mean as far as grades, test scores, activities, background, so on. And even if you do build a list that's highly selective based, don't expect $1 from them. The number of times I hear that, well, how do you get money from Harvard? You don't, right? Harvard could today afford to never have a student pay again based solely off the interest they make on their endowment, which is billions of dollars. Nobody has to pay. But here's the sad truth. Because of the name, we keep paying. We're willing to pay $85,000, $90,000. And if we personally aren't, and we call them, they will say, tough luck. Because I have 50 people on the wait list ready to write me that check tomorrow, right? So if part of your goal here is to make sure that you have opportunities in your schools, among other things, don't just apply to the high selectives because you may not have many options and you definitely won't have financially viable options. Secondly, or tertiary, pardon me, don't slack off at the beginning of senior year. I talked about it before, but if you get deferred from early decision or early action to regular decision, colleges will want to see your first semester senior year grades. And if you're a highly selective school, all you need is that student getting one more B in senior year first semester to say, that's all I needed to no longer consider you. It's that cutthroat. These schools are called B free for a reason. Most applicants who they accept do not have a single B on their transcript from 9th grade through 12th grade, and they'll have an IB diploma, 5 APs in junior year, senior year. I saw multiple students who I worked with and who colleagues of mine worked with this year with 36 or 1,600 SATs, 4.0s in IB diplomas and great course rigor and activities, still denied by these schools because they have so many applicants with those backgrounds. It's scary to think about, but it is true. So don't slack off. Don't join a club just because someone you know is in it. Do it because you see a place where you can make an impact. And lastly, in your essay, and I do a whole webinar on this, I'm just going to try and put it on to 60 seconds. Don't talk about your greatest accomplishments or about how teamwork taught you the importance of working with others, or how going abroad broadened your horizons, or about how being a leader was one of the most important qualities. Let the rest of your application speak for those pieces. Use this personal statement, the big essay that goes to all of your colleges, as an opportunity to teach them about the young individual who's potentially going to change the world at their institution. And yeah, I know how cheesy it is to say change the world, but they want to get to know the authentic you, the individual who's going to come here and make friends with their roommate, who's going to be best friends with their professors, the person who's going to spend all their time either like participating in groups around campus or research or whatnot. Show me who you are in a way I don't yet know. How much does ranking of schools actually affect the job, future job or future career? The ranking of a school makes zero impact. It's the major you pursue, the connections you make. It's part of what I was talking about before, that Malcolm Gladwell Zeitgeist video. He covers all that, but essentially, students who graduate in the top 1% at Virginia Commonwealth University oftentimes beat out students who are in the top 40% at Harvard, right? Sure, if you're in the top percentile or 5 or 10 at an Ivy League or a Stanford, you're probably doing really well and going to have many opportunities. But what about the other 80 to 90% of students who are getting their first Bs of their life, who aren't getting the top internships, right? Those students are struggling, both from a getting opportunity standpoint and from a mental health standpoint. I was actually speaking with a family earlier today who I just wrapped up with their younger son. Their older son went to Princeton. He's going into the end of his sophomore year. He still can't get an internship. Princeton's trying to help him, but he's not getting any internships. He's doing fine, but he's not necessarily doing that stand out at Princeton, and he's having trouble. Talking about Princeton, a school that's on everyone's top 10 list, right? So kids all over the nation are still having trouble getting internships because it's about what you do, the connections you make, the opportunities you create. Can you share net price you pay link or website? It's called, there's no website. It's you go to the school name, net price calculator. Type in University of Maryland net price calculator to Google, and it'll spit out the link for you. So 2 more slides. 1, get past prestige, folks. I know I can't force you to do so, but I can tell you right now that the more you're focused on prestige, the less likely you are to have happy outcomes in this process. Students get into the Ivies every year. Students get into Stanford, they get into UC Berkeley, UCLA, USC. But many more don't get in. These schools are called highly rejective for a reason. Most students who apply do not get in. It's just the truth of the matter. So, if you want to be focused on prestige, that is absolutely your prerogative. But if you focus on why a school is a good fit, what access you'll have to the interests you might have, and the opportunities outside the classroom, proximity to home, student body size, things of that nature, you are much more likely to have a balanced list, one where you have more options, potentially more merit aid, and a happier and more enjoyable process. To that point, if you're a junior right now and you have not taken the SAT or the ACT, or you're thinking about whether or not you want to, you took it once, you're not sure, I recommend you get back at it. You still have this end of this year and this summer to give it a shot. And if you don't have it, you don't have it, but it doesn't hurt. Research is imperative. And I'm not talking about research like research in a lab. I'm talking about researching the colleges you're pursuing. Don't just apply because a friend's neighbor told you you'd like it or because it's a top 10 school. If you do that, you're much less likely to have the options you might want. Make sure that you have an organizational system in place. This may be that every week on Thursdays, you're going to spend 1 hour doing college research, and on Fridays, you're going to talk about it with your parents. It could be that on X date, I'm going to start my common application, so on. Every student that I am working with right now is in the midst of building out their college list, if not close to done with it, is doing college visits or planning them, and is right after AP season going to start their common application, their personal statement. That's where my students are. Where are you within that planning structure? Doesn't mean that you're behind, but it is something that you should be considering, because if you haven't even started talking about it, I don't want you to fall behind. That being said, we are coming up on the 7:30 mark. So if you want this presentation, you can email me and I can send it over to you. In the meantime, I'm going to spend an extra couple of minutes here answering any questions that might be on your minds. For those of you who have to run, I'm going to send this presentation and this recording to Jen McDonald after this, and she will share it out with you in the next couple of days. Thank you for coming. I'm now going to open up to questions. The first of which is, how does a gap year affect the student's application? Well, there's two different types of gap year. There's a PG or a post gap where you go to another school, like a Lawrenceville for a year, keep taking courses. Or there's the gap year where something like Verto, VERTO, which is becoming very popular, where for a semester you go abroad, you do a cool project or work a bit, and then you come back and apply for spring semester or for the following year. It can be very helpful for the student who's struggling to stand out in this process or to pursue any activities. It's a way to help them see your maturity and your ongoing growth. It's not the thing that's going to change your access to a Harvard necessarily, but it can help you if you're struggling to kind of show your maturity and so on, or manage your time, to build that, to kind of show colleges that you've taken the time to do so, and to reapply in the coming fall or spring. You might have mentioned this, but how much does weighted versus unweighted GPA matter? Well, end of the day, every college recalculates your GPA. The Ivies always look at the weighted because most of their qualified applicants are going to have weighted GPAs. But I don't want you looking going, well, because I have 3 APs and they're all Bs, that I have an A. They're looking at the letter grade, right? Especially the more selective you get, they want the letter grade here. Your GPA overall, I'd be looking at it out of a 4.0 scale unweighted. That doesn't mean that they don't look at the weight, but I tend to focus on it from an admissions officer standpoint unweighted because they want A's, not anything lower, ideally. Dual enrollment, I love dual enrollment. Now, one question I got recently that I really liked is, I can do dual enrollment stats or I can do AP stats. What should I do? AP stats all the way. If your school offers it at the AP level, you should do that. The only reason to do dual enrollment is because your school doesn't give you access to something of importance to you or of interest to you in senior year. So you go and do dual enrollment sociology because you're interested in it. But if your school has access to something like AP Calc and you want to do DE Calc because it's easier, don't take the easy road there. Where do you research colleges? I like bigfuture.com, unigo.com, niche.com, and my favorite book is the Fiske Guide, Fiske. The Virginia Tech said they don't take transcripts but have students show academic rigor. What does this mean? Essentially, they don't have time to look at every single transcript before they start review. So what they have you do is they have you fill out an SRAR, self-reported academic record. So you click, and Penn State does this as well, by the way, as do a number of big state schools. You click submit on the application. They then send you a portal. In that portal, it'll say, we've received your application, we've received your payment for your application. Every application usually costs about $75. We've received your letter of recommendation. We now need you to fill out the SRAR. You'll click that link. You'll add in all your classes and stuff there. It allows them to more easily review your course rigor and so on. Do you know when UMD will release their common data set? Well, UMD, their common data set for this year, it'll be about 2 years from now. You won't have a full common data set for about 18 months until after this cycle. So right now, the common data set that we're just getting access to, we're starting to get access to the class of 2023. What kind of leadership helps to get an Ivy League? All of it. They don't just want leaders, they want people who made an impact. They might this year take the president who's a president of 3 different clubs, they might not take them. It's not a formula of leadership, it's a formula of impact. What have you done to impact areas of interest to you, places that you want to help, and so on? Big Future Unigo Niche, NICHE. Thank you, Jen. Is it recommended to share test scores through College Board site? Only if the school requests it. Like, for example, many schools have moved away from requesting it because College Board forces you to pay to send them. So, end of the day, one of my greatest suggestions is, if a school doesn't require you to send the scores, just put it in the application, save the $13. If that school admits you and you decide you want to go there, then pay the $13 to send it. Theoretically, you could send it to all of them, but if you're applying to 16 schools, 16 times 13, I mean, 160, that's like almost $200 right there just to send test scores to schools, and 17 of those 18 you're not even going to be going to, right? So I would only send them if it's required. If it's not, I just self-report. Does early college make your application seem stronger? Do you mean early college is in the early college access option at your school, or do you mean applying early? And yes, you will want to use Naviance. You don't need to use it for research, but you'll need to request your letters of recommendation, your transcripts, all that through Naviance. So current juniors, I'm sure that Ms. McDonald will kind of send out a packet if she hasn't already. And sorry if not, McDonald, I didn't mean to throw you under the bus there, but it'll include everything that you're going to need in order to use Naviance, get it set up over summer, be ready by fall. And for those of you who have not considered who you want to ask for recommendations, I would do that soon. Thank you, Jen. So if you're taking college level courses during your junior year at MoCo, it looks good, but I mean, the question is why, right? And so a college may be curious. If you have access to all these APs at your school, why'd you do the MoCo courses over the APs? So the answer is it's not a bad thing. It's not like it's frowned upon, but it's also not necessarily something that stands out when I know that you have access to many different schools here or courses here. Any questions I missed? College, I think you just answered this, Ms. McDonald, but colleges can only see the SAT scores you submit. That said, you should not be taking the test more than 4 times officially. Really, it's 3, but given recent history, I'm seeing 4 as the maximum number. AP classes, AP scores considered in college admissions process. The AP classes are seen as you taking the highest level available to you, taking on a rigorous course schedule, showing academic proclivity and strength. The AP scores at the most selective schools help me to see that you mastered it. But really, the whole reason that students should have AP scores is so that if you get into the school, you can potentially skip out on that first level class and so on. That's a fair question about chem. We're getting too deep into the weeds. Since we only have a minute left here, I want to stick to bigger questions. Go ahead and email me that if you want to. Why shouldn't you take the SAT more than 3 or 4 times? Number one, students rarely see an improvement after the 3rd or 4th time. They tend to plateau. Number two, the amount of time you're spending doing that and the amount of money potentially, that's time that at an Ivy League, I'd rather see you spending elsewhere. And if it's taking you that long to get there, there may be sort of a reason that we aren't considering you. And number three, quite frankly, some schools do request you to send all scores. University of Maryland has done that in the past. If you don't send all scores and they find out you didn't send all scores, they will automatically deny you. So you don't want to be submitting more than 3 or 4 scores unless there's a really good reason to do so. And yes, diminishing returns. Lastly, do bad AP grades reflect badly on application? Bad AP grades, yes. Bad AP scores, you just don't list them. You always report your 4s and 5s on there. You don't have to report anything below that. They may they aren't going to ask why. It may have a question mark in their minds, but you don't want to. You should put that big X there showing that you got a 1 or a 2. Does it look bad if I take an AP class but do not take the AP exam? It's not ideal, but it doesn't look bad. A 1 or a 2 would look bad. On that note, folks, I am going to stop us here. I'm going to throw my email again in the chat for those of you who would like it. Feel free to email me any other questions or learn more about how I go about my work. Otherwise, thank you all for your time this evening. I hope this was helpful and not too scary. I know we covered a lot, but I promise you, knowing this information will only help you in building a better and more balanced college list and going about this process in a more methodical manner. So thank you for making the time today.